They had been told this moment would be hell. From the deserts of North Africa to the broken villages of Italy and the crumbling fields of France, the German soldiers who surrendered to the Allies believed they were stepping into their graves. Years of Nazi propaganda had filled their heads with terrifying images: prisoners beaten in the streets, starved in dark mines, or paraded through towns as trophies of shame. In the barracks and trenches, whispers of what happened to captured men grew into ghost stories. Better to die fighting, some had said. And now, here they were, weapons dropped, hands raised, surrounded by the enemy they had been taught to hate. Private Ernst Bauer remembered the moment with a chill that stayed in his bones. The dust of Tunisia clung to his face as he was herded with hundreds of other soldiers toward a line of American trucks. He expected snarls, kicks, maybe even gunshots. Instead, one of the guards, a young man no older than he, offered him a cigarette. Ernst stared, unsure if it was a trick. When the guard smiled and lit it for him, the fear only deepened. Why would they be kind, he wondered. What are they planning? For most of these men, surrender did not feel like survival. It felt like stepping into an elaborate trap. Every friendly gesture, a canteen of water, a joke muttered in broken German, was suspect. They were certain that true cruelty would begin once the journey to America started. Behind their guarded eyes, 1,000 questions churned. Would they be beaten, starved, sent to the mines, as the rumor said? Would they ever see their homes again? When the trucks began to roll, the defeated soldiers sat in heavy silence. They studied the American guards, noting their discipline, but also something strange at ease, almost casual confidence. The Americans did not spit on them or shout insults. They did not need to. Their power was quiet, their victory absolute. As the convoys wound through dusty roads and ports crowded with equipment, the Germans saw an empire in motion. Rows of tanks gleamed in the sun, endless lines of supplies loaded onto ships. Even in war, America seemed comfortable. It was a sight that unsettled men who had been taught that the Reich ruled the modern world. And yet, as the journey continued, the expected brutality never came. On the ships bound for America, they found themselves in bunks instead of filthy holds. They were guarded, yes, but not abused. They were fed white bread, coffee, even meat. Some prisoners refused to eat at first, convinced it was poisoned or drugged. Others ate cautiously, waiting for the punishment that would surely follow. But none came. Underneath the vast sky of the Atlantic, disbelief spread like wildfire among the prisoners. Why feed the enemy? They whispered. Why treat us like men? The answers escaped them. Perhaps the Americans wanted healthy workers for forced labor. Perhaps it was all a trick before the real suffering began. Some even believed, half seriously, that they were being fattened for medical experiments. The stories from home had dug deep into their minds, and fear was hard to shake. Each night, as the ship rolled through black waves, the men gathered in corners, smoking in silence. One man would start a tune on a harmonica, soft and uncertain. Another would murmur a prayer. And above it all, the thought pulsed like a heartbeat: what awaits us on the other side of the ocean? They had grown up believing they were part of an unbreakable Reich destined to rule 1,000 years. Now those same men stood at the edge of defeat, prisoners of a country they had been told was decadent, chaotic, and weak. But as the ships pushed farther west, toward a land they barely understood, a different truth was beginning to take shape, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew. The first crack in the illusion had formed. The voyage across the Atlantic was unlike anything the German prisoners had imagined. They had prepared themselves for darkness and hunger, for the suffocating stench of cramped holds and the bark of angry guards. Instead, what greeted them was something closer to order and bewildering civility. The transport ships were guarded, yes, but they were not cages of cruelty. There was discipline, routine, and even a strange sense of calm. The prisoners were counted, assigned bunks, and given food that seemed too generous to be real. White bread, stewed meat, coffee that steamed in tin cups. Men who had survived on black bread and thin broth for months stared in silence as plates were passed to them. "It is a trick," someone muttered. "No one feeds prisoners like this." Private Ernst Bauer, who had fought in Africa, studied each bite before daring to taste it. He expected the bitterness of poison. Instead, he tasted salt, grease, and the unmistakable flavor of ordinary life, the kind of food he had not seen since before the war. It was so simple, and yet it made him ache. Across the table, Sergeant Vogel, older and gaunt, stared into his coffee as if it were a mirage. "We lost to people who can feed even their prisoners," he said softly. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the deck rails, a horizon that seemed to swallow everything they had once believed. Some stood at the edge at night, staring at the stars, their breath visible in the cold. The hum of the engines, the creak of metal, these sounds became the rhythm of captivity. Yet what disturbed them most was not the ocean size, but the strange humanity of their captors. One evening, the prisoners heard music. A faint, tinny sound drifted across the deck from a small radio, held by one of the guards, a jazzy swing tune, alien yet irresistible. The rhythm pulsed through the air, and a few Americans even tapped their feet, laughing. The Germans exchanged uneasy glances. They had been told American culture was degenerate, a noise born of chaos and corruption. But as the melody floated over the water, it felt alive, free in a way that both fascinated and frightened them. For many, that music was the first glimpse of what lay ahead, a world where sound, comfort, and laughter could exist even in war. Days blurred into nights. The voyage was long, and in the dim belly of the ship, time lost meaning. Letters were impossible, and no one knew what awaited them. Still, rumors spread. Some claimed they were being taken to labor camps in Alaska. Others whispered of secret mines deep underground. Yet when they caught glimpses of American sailors moving through the decks laughing, joking, living as if the war were a distant rumor, doubt began to creep in. Could this really be the brutal nation their leaders had described? Then, one morning, the call came from the deck. "Land ahead." The men crowded toward the railings, hearts pounding. And there it was, the faint outline of a coast unlike any they had ever seen. Towering cranes, harbors bristling with ships, endless rows of warehouses and smokestacks. America, a place they had imagined only through propaganda posters and whispered myths. The prisoners stood in stunned silence. Some felt awe, others a cold fear. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a nation of abundance and power, untouched by the destruction that had swallowed Europe. For men who had fought in desperation, who had seen cities turn to rubble, this sight was unbearable. Sergeant Vogel exhaled slowly, his voice low. "Now I understand why we lost." As the ships pulled into harbor, the guards prepared to disembark. Trucks and buses waited along the docks. The prisoners filed out in silence, their boots echoing against the wooden planks. American soldiers handed out water, cigarettes, and sandwiches with casual indifference. It was not kindness so much as confidence, the behavior of victors who had no need for cruelty. As the convoy began its journey inland, the men stared out the windows. Neon signs glowed in small towns. Gas stations gleamed under spotless glass. Children waved at the passing trucks, and women went about their errands as if the war existed on another planet. To the prisoners, the sight was surreal, a land of plenty, untouched, ordinary. In that moment, the realization began to sink in. They were no longer part of a conquering army. They were guests or captives in a country so vast and strange it made their old world seem impossibly small. None of them could guess that their real transformation had not even begun. The true shock of captivity, the one that would change them forever, was still waiting, hidden behind fences, inside the heart of America itself. The first breath of American air felt heavy with disbelief. The German prisoners had prepared for humiliation, for the sneer of the conqueror, for punishment disguised as mercy. Yet as the buses rolled away from the harbor and deeper into the American countryside, What they encountered instead was a quiet, unnerving normalcy. From the windows, they saw a world so open and vast it felt unreal. Fields stretched endlessly, divided by white fences and dotted with barns that looked like they had come from children's storybooks. Roads seemed to run forever, bordered by billboards advertising soap, gasoline, and Coca-Cola words that meant little but sounded strangely cheerful. Private Ernst Bauer pressed his face to the glass, his breath fogging the window. "It is like a painting," he whispered. Behind him, Sergeant Vogel said nothing. He was watching the passing people, a farmer waving as the convoy passed, a group of schoolchildren pointing excitedly at the strange sight of captured soldiers behind truck windows. One girl even smiled and waved, her red ribbon fluttering in the wind. For an instant, Ernst's heart clenched. She was about the same age as his daughter back home in Munich. He raised his hand slightly before catching himself. What would it mean, he thought, to wave back at the enemy? The convoy stopped at intervals for rest. The prisoners expected shouting, perhaps searches or blows, but instead, guards offered them canteens of water and sandwiches wrapped in paper. One of the Americans, noticing their hesitation, said with a grin, "You can eat, fellas, no tricks." His tone was so casual it disarmed them more effectively than any weapon. They passed through small towns where locals gathered curiously along the roadsides. Some faces were wary, others indifferent, a few openly friendly. No one jeered. No one threw stones. To the prisoners, this was the strangest humiliation of all, to be treated not as monsters, but as men. When the buses finally stopped, the camps came into view. Rows of neat barracks, tall fences crowned with barbed wire, guard towers at regular intervals. Yet even here, order replaced terror. The men were processed quickly, names recorded, belongings logged, bunk assignments issued. Inside the barracks, they found real beds, metal frames, with mattresses, sheets, and blankets. The air smelled faintly of soap and sawdust instead of rot. The guards, stern but not cruel, explained the rules through interpreters. Roll call twice a day. No fighting. No escapes. Anyone caught breaking discipline would face confinement, not torture. It was strange, efficient, even respectful. At the mess hall, the smell of cooked meat filled the air. The prisoners filed in cautiously, expecting watery soup or stale bread. Instead, trays were filled with meatloaf, potatoes, beans, coffee, food rich and warm, far better than anything they would eaten in months. Some men refused at first, convinced it was poisoned or drugged. But hunger won, and as they ate, disbelief turned to silent astonishment. "It tastes like home," one soldier murmured. Another replied, "Better than home." Later that night, in the quiet hum of the barracks, Ernst wrote his first censored letter home. He struggled to find words that would not be blacked out by the American censor. "We are treated." Well, he wrote hesitantly. "We are alive and we have food." He paused, pen trembling, before adding, "You would not believe it." For the first time since his capture, he felt something he had not expected: shame. Not just for losing the war, but for believing the lies that had made him fear this place. As the lights dimmed, he lay back on his bunk, staring at the wooden beams above him. Outside, the sounds of the camp, distant footsteps, murmured voices, the rustle of night air blended into something almost peaceful. And yet, no one slept easily. Beneath the comfort lay an unease that none could name. If this was captivity, what was its purpose? Why would their enemies show them kindness? The next day, they would learn the routines of camp life, the order, the work, and the quiet dignity allowed to them. But even then, they could not know that the greatest revelation of all was still waiting: a flicker of light in the darkness, a sound of laughter they thought they would forgotten. They could not yet imagine that soon, behind the barbed wire, they would find something far stranger than cruelty. They would find wonder. The days in the American camps unfolded with a rhythm that was both alien and strangely comforting. The German prisoners woke each morning to the sound of whistles, stood in lines for roll call, and marched to meals that still felt like an impossible luxury. Everything ran with precision, yet without the menace they had expected. It was captivity, yes, but it was not punishment. Private Ernst Bauer quickly learned the daily order of things: inspection, breakfast, work detail, rest. After weeks of battle and flight, the predictability was disorienting. He found himself almost grateful for the structure, though he never said so aloud. The guards were firm but unthreatening, young men with steady eyes who spoke in calm voices rather than shouts. When they were not on duty, they leaned on fence posts, smoking or laughing together, small, ordinary gestures that chipped away at the aura of fear the prisoners had carried across the ocean. The food remained a constant wonder. Plates heavy with meat, vegetables, and coffee thick enough to drink in silence. Men whispered their disbelief at night. "This can't last," said one. "They will cut our rations soon. This is just to make us soft." But it did last, day after day, week after week. Rumors spread that the prisoners were being fed the same rations as American soldiers. It was unthinkable, yet no one could deny what they saw. Sergeant Vogel sat across from Ernst one evening, turning a fork in his hand. "When I write to my wife," he said quietly, "how can I tell her this? She is standing in bread lines. She would not believe me." He smiled bitterly. "She might think I have gone mad." Letters home became lifelines. Though censored, they offered a fragile connection to a world that now felt distant and dreamlike. "We are treated fairly," many wrote, choosing words carefully. "We are healthy." Between the lines, families could sense the truth that their sons and husbands were living better as captives than they were as civilians under the Reich's collapse. Beyond the fences, life stretched on. The camps were often built near small American towns, surrounded by farmland or forest. Through the wire, the prisoners could see farmers tending crops, children chasing dogs, women hanging laundry in the breeze. These sights tormented and comforted them in equal measure. It was peace, simple and casual, something they had almost forgotten existed. Work details filled their days. Some were assigned to mend fences, build roads, or harvest crops under guard. The Americans paid them in small tokens, camp scrip, or cigarettes, which they could use to buy soap, stationery, or an occasional treat. It was not much, but it gave them purpose. Under the open sky, hoeing fields or stacking lumber, the men sometimes forgot for a moment that they were prisoners. The evenings brought their own rhythm. After dinner, some played cards or chess. Others read from the small camp libraries, which contained both German classics and translated American novels. A few of the more skilled men carved wooden figures or painted scenes from memory's snow-covered villages, ruined streets, faces of loved ones they might never see again. The guards, to everyone's surprise, encouraged it. "Keeps them calm," one said with a shrug, but the effect went deeper. For soldiers taught that the enemy was monstrous. Every small act of kindness was a seed of doubt. Discipline still existed, of course. Escape attempts were punished, though rarely with violence. Instead, offenders were confined or stripped of privileges. This measured fairness confused the prisoners more than brutality ever could. One evening, when a group of men was caught hiding tools near the fence, the expected beatings never came. Instead, the commandant assembled the camp and announced calmly, "No one escapes America." The men were reassigned to kitchen duty. It was humiliating, but it was also merciful. That night, whispers filled the barracks. "They could have shot us," one man said. Another replied, "They did not need to." Even as comfort settled into routine, guilt began to grow. Ernst often lay awake, thinking of the war still raging across the ocean, the bombings, the family starving, the comrades still fighting for a doomed cause. The warmth of his bunk felt like betrayal. One evening, as he washed his hands in the mess hall basin, he caught his reflection in the metal cleaner, healthier than he had been in years. Is this captivity, he wondered? Or was it something more dangerous, a quiet erosion of everything he had once believed? The men spoke less of the Reich now, and more of the strange new world they glimpsed each day. America was no longer just an enemy. It was a riddle. Its power was not only in its weapons, but in its abundance, its ease, and its baffling compassion. None of them yet understood that this was only the beginning, that the Americans had another surprise waiting for them. One that would come not from rations or rules, but from light, sound, and story. Soon, a different kind of weapon would enter the camps, one made not of steel or bullets, but of imagination. The first hint that something unusual was coming began as a rumor, a whisper passed through the barracks, like a secret too strange to believe. "They are setting up a projector," someone said. "A real one, like in the cinemas." At first, no one took it seriously. What sense did it make? Why would their captors waste electricity and film reels on prisoners of war? The men had grown accustomed to odd surprises in America: war meals, fair treatment, letters home, but movies, that was absurd. And yet, the next evening, the rumor proved true. As dusk fell, guards began moving equipment into one of the large recreation halls. Prisoners, curious but cautious, gathered near the entrance. Inside, a white sheet had been stretched tight across the far wall. In the center of the room stood a bulky metal projector, its reels gleaming faintly under the overhead lights. Rows of benches filled the hall, hastily arranged but inviting. Private Ernst Bauer stared in disbelief. "They are not serious," he murmured. Sergeant Vogel only shook his head. "If it is a propaganda film, I will walk out," he muttered, though they both knew he would not. When the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the crowd. The hum of the projector filled the room, low and mechanical, like the heartbeat of something alive. Then, without warning, the beam of light cut through the darkness, dust motes dancing like ghosts, and images sprang to life on the sheet. At first, the men did not know what they were seeing. A cowboy galloping across an endless plain, the sound of hooves pounding, the distant crack of gunfire. A saloon laughter, music scenes so vivid and foreign that the prisoners sat frozen. Then came the laughter, the shouts, the rhythm of an entirely different world. It was not a propaganda reel. It was a Hollywood film. Some of the men leaned forward, eyes wide, their faces flickering with the light of the screen. Others exchanged puzzled looks, unsure whether to trust what they were watching. Then a slapstick scene unfolded, a comic actor tripping over his own boots, landing in a trough, and the first laugh burst out. Sharp, unexpected, human. Another laugh followed, and another, until the hall rippled with sound. For a moment, the war vanished. The guards stood along the walls, watching with folded arms. Some smiled quietly at the sight of men who only months ago had fought to kill them, now laughing at the antics of Charlie Chaplin. In that moment, the barbed wire and uniforms seemed to dissolve. When the film ended, the lights came up slowly. The prisoners blinked, as though waking from a dream. A few clapped hesitantly. Others sat in silence, overwhelmed. Vogel rubbed his forehead. "What was that?" he said softly. "They showed us. Joy." Ernst did not answer. He was still staring at the blank sheet, where the last image had faded. He had expected sermons or gloating victory speeches, or some cunning attempt to humiliate them. Instead, he had seen something pure, a world where men laughed, where no one shouted orders, where even mistakes became comedy instead of death sentences. The next day, the camp buzzed with talk. "Did you see the horses?" one man said. "Those skies, they looked endless." Others argued over the meaning. Some insisted it was propaganda, a trick meant to soften them. But deep down, most knew it was not. It was entertainment, something so simple and human that it felt almost forbidden. When evening came again, the guards announced another screening. This time, no one hesitated. Men hurried through dinner, crowded into the hall, jostling for seats. They did not know what film they would see, but it did not matter. They wanted to feel that flicker of light again. That night, as the projector hummed and shadows danced on the walls, Ernst caught himself smiling without realizing it. The warmth of it startled him. For the first time since capture, he felt something close to freedom, not of body, but of mind. The flickering images had done what no speech or lesson could. They had reminded these men of their own humanity. They were prisoners still, surrounded by wire and watchtowers. But for 2 hours each night, the fences disappeared into the dark, and the world became something else vast, absurd, and achingly alive. And though none of them yet understood it, those glowing reels of film were beginning to do something dangerous. They were beginning to change hearts. By the time the second week of screenings began, the projector had become the camp's heartbeat. Whenever a guard appeared at sunset carrying film reels under his arm, murmurs would spread instantly through the barracks. Men who had once spent their nights brooding in silence now rushed through their dinners, polishing boots or washing their hands as if preparing for a sacred ritual. The first nights had been met with suspicion. Now they were met with anticipation. On one such evening, Private Ernst Bauer and Sergeant Vogel found seats on a wooden bench near the middle of the hall. Around them, the hum of conversation filled the air, low, eager, almost childlike. The guards dimmed the lights, and the mechanical whir of the projector began again. The beam of light sliced through the smoke-filled room, and once more, the flickering world of Hollywood came alive. Tonight's film was a comedy, a classic from the Marx Brothers. Within minutes, the room was echoing with laughter. Soldiers who had not smiled in years clutched their sides, gasping as the absurdity unfolded. Even the most stoic officers cracked faint smiles as chaos played out on the screen, furniture collapsing, doors slamming, words flying faster than bullets. At first, the humor felt foreign. The Americans laughed at things the Germans found strange: rebellion against authority, the clever trickster outwitting pompous men in uniforms, workers mocking their bosses. Yet the laughter was infectious. And somewhere beneath the jokes, the prisoners began to feel something shift, a strange, liberating joy that came from watching order turned upside down. After the show, men lingered outside, still grinning. They mocked their own leaders. One soldier said incredulously, "In Germany, we would be shot for that." Vogel shook his head in wonder. "Maybe that is why they are winning," he murmured. Not every screening was laughter. Some nights brought westerns, vast landscapes of dust and freedom. The prisoners watched cowboys gallop across endless plains, their faces glowing with reflected light. For men who had spent years behind propaganda banners promising a 1,000-year empire, the simplicity of those wide open horizons felt almost painful. America, they realized, was not the weak, chaotic land they had been taught to despise. It was something else entirely wild, creative, boundless. Other nights, musicals lit up the room, bright costumes, synchronized dances, and voices that soared. The Germans sat transfixed. "They sing while at war," whispered one. "They can afford to sing." In that statement was both awe and defeat. The contrast between Germany's grim, rationed existence and America's effortless abundance was overwhelming. Then came romance films, soft lights, clever dialogue, women with independent minds and dazzling smiles. Those stories provoked a deeper kind of silence. In Nazi Germany, women had been symbols of duty, mothers, workers, citizens of the state. Here, they laughed freely, made choices, even challenged men without fear. It was confusing, even unsettling, for soldiers who had lived in a world where obedience was the highest virtue. Ernst, who had barely spoken of his wife since his capture, found himself remembering her face as he watched one of these films, not as a symbol of home or family, but as a person, vivid and alive. He wondered, for the first time, what kind of life she might have wanted beyond the war. The projector, week by week, became a strange kind of teacher. Without a single command or speech, it showed the prisoners a world built on contradiction, chaos, and creativity, freedom and discipline, laughter and pain. It undermined every lesson they had been taught about America's supposed moral decay. Even the newsreels that accompanied the films delivered shocks. The prisoners watched footage of American factories roaring with production, ships sliding down ramps by the dozens, soldiers marching not with fanaticism, but with confidence. To men who had watched their own supply lines collapse, the sight was devastating. They have everything, Vogel said quietly. Even their workers look strong. Still, the screenings were never mandatory. The Americans insisted attendance was voluntary, and yet the hall was always full. Those who claimed indifference found themselves drawn in anyway, curious despite themselves. Maybe we go because it is better than the barracks, one man said. Or maybe. He trailed off, unable to finish. What none of them could admit, not yet, was that the films were starting to touch something deeper. Each night, as the lights dimmed and the reels began to spin, the men were reminded of something they had almost forgotten, what it meant to feel human again. For 2 hours, they were not soldiers or prisoners. They were simply men, watching stories unfold about love, courage, and the messy, joyful absurdity of life. When the lights came back on and reality returned, silence always followed. The men filed out slowly, faces blank, hearts full of something they could not name. And in that silence, one question began to grow like a quiet spark among them. If this is the enemy's world, were we wrong all along? The months that followed were quieter, steadier, but something profound had changed inside the camps. What began as disbelief had turned into fascination, and what had once been suspicion was slowly becoming respect. The prisoners no longer went to the screenings just for distraction. They went to learn. Each night, after the projector's light faded and the men filed back to their bunks, conversations carried long into the dark. They no longer whispered about rations or rumors of release. They spoke of the films, the stories, the characters, the way the Americans laughed at themselves. One man admired the courage of a film's heroine. Another wondered aloud how a society could allow so much freedom and still remain strong. They are not afraid of words, Sergeant Vogel said one night, lying on his bunk. Even their newspapers argue with their leaders. Ernst listened silently, tracing the edge of his blanket. In our country, he said, we called that treason. The more they watched, the more they began to recognize something dangerous, a truth hidden behind the laughter and music. The power of America did not lie only in its factories or its armies. It was in its people, their creativity, their individuality, their freedom to question everything, even themselves. The guards noticed it too. Men who had once saluted the Reich's ideals with blind certainty now debated morality and justice over chess games. Younger soldiers began asking to learn English, copying down phrases they would heard on screen. Some even tried to mimic the swagger of the American cowboys they would admired, shoulders loose, heads high, a casual confidence that was utterly foreign to men trained to obey without question. In the mess hall, laughter came more easily. Men sang snippets of songs from the musicals, humming the melodies as they worked. The barbed wire was still there, the guards still armed, but the psychological distance had begun to shrink. Even the officers, the ones who tried to maintain discipline and dignity, could feel it. One evening, a colonel confronted his men. "You are prisoners of war, not guests in a theater," he barked. "Do not forget who you are," but his words fell flat. The soldiers had seen too much. They had glimpsed a different kind of power, one that did not command, but inspired. Ernst wrote to his wife again. His handwriting was neater now, his words calmer. "We work during the day and watch moving pictures at night," he wrote. "The Americans laugh easily. They even laugh at themselves. It is strange, it feels human." He hesitated, then added carefully, "If this is their weakness, it is a very strong one." What the Americans may not have realized was that the films were doing what no lecture or propaganda leaflet could. They were reshaping minds. Slowly, quietly, the rigid walls of ideology that had held these men prisoner long before they ever saw a camp were beginning to crumble. Even so, the transformation brought unease. At night, after the lights went out, guilt crept in. "Are we betraying our country by enjoying their stories?" one soldier asked. Vogel replied softly, "Maybe we are just remembering what it means to live." That guilt deepened as letters arrived from home. Families wrote of bombings, hunger, and hopelessness. Cities reduced to rubble. Children growing up in shelters. Compared to that devastation, the comfort of the American camps felt almost sinful. "They feed us better than our own people," one man said, his voice thick with shame. "What right do we have to be here laughing at comedies while our families starve?" But it was too late. The spark had been lit. For Ernst and many others, the world on the screen had cracked open something inside them, an awareness that no amount of indoctrination could fully erase. They had been told that obedience was strength, that freedom was chaos, that compassion was weakness. Yet here they were, living proof that those ideas were false. When new prisoners arrived, hardened men from the final battles in Europe, they sneered at the softness of those who had been in America longer. But after a few weeks, after a few films, their tone changed too. The laughter caught them. The light touched them. One by one, the walls fell. In time, the camps themselves seemed to hum with a new energy, less defiant, more reflective. The Americans had not needed to preach democracy or boast about victory. They simply rolled in their projector carts night after night and let light do the talking. It was, perhaps, the quietest form of conquest in history. Not of land or power, but of imagination. When the war finally ended, the world outside the fences was almost unrecognizable. Germany had fallen. Cities once filled with parades and promises were now ash and silence. For the prisoners in America, news of the Reich's surrender arrived like an echo from another life. Some cheered. Others wept. Many simply sat in stunned quiet, unsure whether to feel relief or loss. They had lived behind wire for months, even years, and yet for many of them, the camp had come to feel more real than the home they remembered. Letters spoke of ruins, hunger, and families scattered. "You will not recognize it," one wife wrote. "Everything is gone." The men read those words under the bright American sun, their stomachs full and their bodies healthy, and the guilt returned like a shadow. Repatriation began slowly. Groups of men were gathered, processed, and loaded onto ships that would carry them back across the same ocean they had crossed in fear. But now the journey was different. The seas were calmer, and the faces around them older, quieter. On deck, the men stood side by side, watching America's coastline recede into the horizon, the cranes, the towers, the endless sprawl of power and plenty. Private Ernst Bauer gripped the railing, his fingers white against the metal. "They will never believe us," he said. Sergeant Vogel nodded, his eyes fixed on the fading land. "No," he replied. "How could they?" On the voyage home, the men spoke in hushed tones about the lives they had lived in captivity. They remembered the taste of American coffee, the sound of laughter echoing through the barracks, the strange warmth of guards who treated them as human beings. But above all, they spoke of the films. The light that had flickered on those makeshift screens had done something permanent, something no ocean could wash away. When they reached Europe, the reception was cold. Germany was in ruins. Families met them with relief, but also suspicion. "You were prisoners," some said bitterly. "You do not know what we suffered." And they did not fully. For those who had spent the war behind wire, the devastation of home felt like a nightmare glimpsed from afar. When they spoke of America, few listened. The idea that their enemies had shown them kindness, that they had watched movies and played football and eaten, well, it sounded impossible, even shameful. "They will think we have gone soft," one former prisoner said. "Or worse, that we have forgotten who we are." And yet, the stories spread anyway. Quietly, at first around dinner tables, in workshops, in letters shared among friends. Men told of nights when the guards set up a projector and the entire camp sat in silence, watching cowboys, comedians, and dreamers come to life. They spoke of how laughter had echoed through the barracks like music. They told their children that for a few hours each night, even as enemies, they had felt the world become human again. Years passed. The war's scars began to fade, but the memory of those screenings endured. Historians who later interviewed the former prisoners were startled by how often the movies came up. They had expected tales of hardship or escape attempts, but instead they heard stories about Chaplain Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers' names that had crossed the barbed wire and settled deep into memory. One former POW laughed as he recalled it. "Imagine we were supposed to hate them, but they made us laugh. That is power." Another grew serious. "Those films showed me something my commanders never could, that freedom is not chaos. It is courage." For many, the influence lasted long after they returned home. In post-war Germany, as the country rebuilt itself, a new generation grew curious about American music, films, and ideas. And often, it was the former prisoners, the men who had once sat beneath the flickering glow of projectors in Texas, Oklahoma, or Illinois, who encouraged that curiosity. They had seen another kind of strength, one that did not demand worship, but invited wonder. The Marshall Plan rebuilt cities, but the stories these men brought home helped rebuild minds. They became quiet bridges between two worlds once locked in hatred. A few even credited those nights in captivity with shaping their belief in democracy and tolerance, ideas they would later pass on to their children. When asked decades later what they remembered most about their imprisonment, the answer was rarely about food or labor. It was the light, the projector beam cutting through the dark, the laughter, the moment the enemy became human. One veteran put it simply, "We saw America not through guns, but through film. And in that light, we stopped being soldiers." The legacy of those screenings outlived the war itself. In the most unlikely of places, behind fences, underguard, the seeds of reconciliation were planted. What bullets and bombs could never achieve, stories and laughter quietly did. Even in captivity, even in defeat, the prisoners discovered something no propaganda could destroy, that imagination was stronger than hate, and that the glow of a movie screen could illuminate even the darkest corners of the human heart. And in that flickering light, they found something none of them expected, not victory, not freedom, but something far rarer. They found peace.